Now, let me take you to the second part of today's lecture, that is economic vulnerability. And when it comes to the economic vulnerability, you may be thinking the definition of economic vulnerability, how it is different from physical vulnerability. Students, economic vulnerability is how individuals, households, communities and regions are susceptible to economic loss and financial instability through hazards or shocks. It is a measure of the ability of individuals to handle and overcome losses. Now, let me explain to you the concept of vulnerability in relation with economic. Economic vulnerability is very much close to asset ownership, income level, insurance coverage and saving, employment security. In other words, individuals with low economic assets are disproportionately affected by the catastrophes and climate extremes. Now, let me explain to you the concept of exposure in relation with economic vulnerability. Economic exposure takes place when agriculture, fisheries and tourism are climate sensitive sectors which form a substantial portion of livelihood. Whole local economies are dependent as on industry or resources. Workers are either on informal or daily wage employment. For example, farmers exposed to drought, coastal fishers, cyclone, they are exposed to cyclone, vendors in the street who are subjected to floods and heat waves. The high exposure causes chances of loss of income and livelihood. Now, let me explain to you the concept of sensitivity with economic vulnerability. Delicacy in economic vulnerability is contingent upon income diversification level, producible asset ownership, social protection processes, the availability of credit and insurance. A day wage worker who is rendered jobless in 1 week could be hungry, and yet a worker on a salary could be intact financially. Therefore, there are differences in the economic sensitivity between social groups. Now, let me explain to you the economic vulnerability structural causes. Students, the vulnerability of an economy is never in the individualistic sense of an individual. Rather, it is structural and systematic in nature. The key causes include lack of social security, poverty and inequality, informal employment, debt and financial exclusion, shocks and the market and prices. Marginal populations do not tend to have formal banking, insurance and governmental relief, which makes them more vulnerable in the long term. Now, let me explain to you the consequence of economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability is caused by loss of sources of livelihood and earnings, increased indebtedness, less investment into education and health, intergenerational poverty, forced migration. The recovery of the economically vulnerable population is slower due to the disaster, and thus the population becomes caught in the risk deprivation cycle. So, after explaining you the concept of economic and physical vulnerability, now let me explain to you the social vulnerability. Social vulnerability is the level at which the social groups fail to foresee, manage and endure and recuperate influences of hazards. It is caused by social inequalities, relation of power and institutional setups. Social vulnerability targets who is impacted on and why as opposed to where and how only. Now, let me explain to you the concept of exposure in context with the social vulnerability. Some social groups are exposed more as a result of their work and living conditions, and they include children, women, elderly people, persons with disabilities, migrants and informal immigrants, marginalized and indigenous communities. An example include women who are usually more exposed due to caregiving duties, lack of mobility as well as access to information. Now let me explain to you the concept of sensitivity in relation to vulnerability. Social vulnerability is sensitive to education and informal accessibility, health status, discrimination and cultural norms. Support system and social network, legal rights and status. The systems are also disadvantaged to such an extent that the socially marginalized groups can be more injured even when they are equally exposed. So now let me explain to you the concept of sensitivity and social inequality. The social vulnerability lies in gender inequality, ethnic and caste discrimination, class division, political exclusion. Disasters tend to amplify the already existing inequalities, and on the other hand, they leave vulnerable group even more vulnerable after occurrence of a disaster. So now let me explain to you social capital and institution. What is the importance? Social vulnerability can be mitigated through strong social networks and community organizations, and also through inclusive institutions that can enable information exchange, improve the relief and recovery program by providing mutual aid, by providing assistance to the targeted group. Therefore, vulnerability can be changed through empowerment, participation and inclusive governance that can be achieved. Now the question again arises, who are most vulnerable? Students, rising sea level have a big effect on coastal areas like West Bengal, Odisha, Tamil Nadu and island nations like Maldives. Farmers and others who live in the country dependent on monsoons, they have to deal with the drought, crop failure and not sufficient water. People living in the urban slums who are impoverished have to deal with the heat waves, not enough water and health problems. In the same way, indigenous people in the Amazon forest and northeastern India are at danger of losing their homes, job and the way of life. Not only this, kids, old people, women, they are also more vulnerable to be hurt by climate related health problems and economic disruptions.